Good evening. Is it not loud enough? Now it's loud enough. Thank you. We're so very glad to have you all joining us tonight. I'm Dr. Amy Dunlap, and along with my colleague, Dr. Nathan Muchala, we're interim co-directors for the Whitney R. Harris World Ecology Center at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And as you may know, UMSL is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. Nathan sends his greetings to you from Ecuador. He's probably in some amazing spot right now. Through a generous and forward-thinking endowment from Whitney and Anna Harris, we're able to organize this conservation forum each fall. We're now in our 27th year of this community event. Please thank Anna Harris, who is with us this evening with her daughter, Teresa. Thank you, Anna. And thanks to the St. Louis Zoo for hosting us tonight. The Harris Center is a partnership between the Department of Biology at UMSL, the St. Louis Zoo, and the Missouri Botanical Gardens. Together, we support the research and training of graduate and undergraduate students in ecology, evolution, and conservation. This is a great collaboration, sending trained scientists all over the world to take decision-making positions that influence the path of conservation in over 37 different countries, including here in Missouri. I have a number of people to thank for tonight's event, including our program coordinator, Angela Stern, Bethany Zollman, our department chair, Catherine Werner, who serves on our leadership council, as well as Danielle Behrens, Don Weaver, Sean Lofgren, and all of the staff here at the St. Louis Zoo working this event. I'd also like to thank the continued support of the St. Louis community for the efforts in support of the Harris Center. Two of our recent conservation forums focused on indigenous ecological knowledge and sustainability. And so before we get going, I want to acknowledge the people who lived and thrived in St. Louis, both before and after European settlement. St. Louis has been an urban area for a long time, and we sit on the ancestral lands of the Osage, Missouri, and Illini people who were forcibly removed from the area. Our theme tonight is on urban heat island effects and what we can do to mitigate them. Because of the built environment of cities, they're warmer on average than the areas surrounding those cities. And we see that here in St. Louis, both in the past and today. Paved roads and parking lots and buildings absorb heat during the day and radiate it back out during the night. This makes cities hotter in the daytime, but it also keeps them warmer at night. That cities are hotter is something that we simply know from our weather forecasts every day. And if you're a gardener, all those important dates for the last and first frosts of the year. This is a visual from a report this past January from the East-West Gateway Council of Governments. The warmer colors indicate warmer temperatures. Those red areas also overlap substantially with areas of impervious surface, roads, pavement, parking lots, and buildings. St. Louis is one of the oldest cities in the country for the age of the housing stock. Most of our buildings predate 1950. Our beautiful brick buildings are plentiful, but also hold on to heat. When you add that to the sheer amounts of pavement in proportion to greener spaces, it and other factors place St. Louis in the top 25 cities in the nation for urban heat effects. Our third speaker, Stephen Duong, will be telling us more about these effects and what we can do about them. Excess heat has wide-ranging effects on wildlife and on plants. This summer featured a number of viral photos of melted squirrels. Of course, they haven't melted, but they have flattened themselves against a surface to transfer heat away from their bodies, a behavior called heat dumping. As summers get hotter, cities are becoming even more hot. A growing body of research is documenting what is happening with plants, animals, and microbes in addition to humans, as well as the complex ecological interactions that urban heat is playing a role in. Our second speaker, Dr. Kaylee Arnold, will be sharing some of the work and thoughts that she has about this growing area of biology. And finally, excessive heat is the biggest cause of weather-related deaths in this country. Squirrels don't have air conditioners, but neither do some people. And some people have air conditioners but can't afford to run them very much. When you add on climate change and heating of our environment, we have serious implications for human health and well-being. St. Louis has a history with heat waves and their human costs. Our first speaker will be talking to us about extreme heat in St. Louis. He is Dr. Andrew Hurley, a professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Dr. Hurley has written widely on topics related to the urban environment and history of St. Louis, including a book on the environmental history of St. Louis. He's currently working on a book about the 1936 heat wave in the American Midwest. I'm very happy to welcome my colleague Andrew to the stage.
Good evening, everybody. Well, if you live in St. Louis, or if you have spent time here in the summer, you know that St. Louis gets very hot. And according to projections, it's going to get hotter. I'm a historian, so I am interested in what has already happened, but not for its own sake. I'm interested in the past and what it might and how it might help us with perspective on our current predicaments with regard to climate and what the future may hold. So what I'm going to be doing for the next 30 minutes or so is taking you on a quick journey through the 20th and early 21st century to explore the way St. Louisans have encountered and dealt with heat, particularly extreme heat, in the past, to see what kind of useful wisdom might emerge. And I'm going to start off with two stories or incidents that I came across in my research. The first one took place in the context of a grueling heat wave that engulfed the city of St. Louis in temperatures above 90 degrees for nearly 7 weeks in the summer of 1901, a period that also included some brief spikes of successive days of 100-plus degree weather. In the midst of that, a young woman named Estelle Nidel decided to end her life. The 19-year-old woman was homeless and distraught, tossed to the streets by her lover and spurned by a mother who objected to her taste in men. A despondent Nidel dragged herself by foot toward the Compton Hill Reservoir, where she intended to end her life. Along the way, while passing through a field of tall grass, she collapsed from heat exhaustion. She lay there for 4 days, at which point a passerby discovered her still breathing body and carried it to a nearby hospital, where she was eventually nursed back to health. Newspaper reports acknowledge the fortuitous circumstances of her collapse. The natural cooling properties of lush vegetation had most likely saved her life. A century later, in a location not far from the spot where Nidel fell, 2 unsupervised children baked to death in the back seat of a locked automobile. At 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature outside the vehicle sat slightly above seasonal averages. But inside the car, the temperature rose to 114 degrees. The tragedy of the children's death provoked outcry and protest among the residents of McCreetown, a predominantly African American and low-income neighborhood, who blamed the deaths on an absence of city services and police protection that contributed to the breakdown of informal community support networks. Separated by 100 years, these incidents occurred against the backdrop of rising planetary temperatures caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Yet the difference between survival and death in these cases had less to do with global weather patterns than with shifts in the physical and social arrangements that structured urban life. And the juxtaposition of these stories calls our attention to the way that urban development has mediated the impact of climate on city dwellers. And one of the most important developments has been the proliferation of disparate, highly variegated microclimates within urban areas, such as that field where Needell fell and the car where the two boys baked to death. In this evening's talk, I want to explore the ways that St. Louisans have navigated this patchy thermal landscape of their own making so that we might better appreciate the relationship between climate change and localized placemaking. Oh, I'm on the, no. Okay, what we see here is a chart of the average daily temperatures recorded at Lambert Airport between 1930 and 2022. And as you can see, there's fluctuation from year to year, ups and downs, but if we kind of plot the average slope, we see a discernible rise. And that rise tracks to a certain extent broader changes in regional and planetary climate temperatures. If we look at the change in temperatures on a global scale, the planet has averaged about a 2-degree Fahrenheit warm-up since 1890. On a more local level, well, it's at a national level. If you look at the United States, since 1901, average surface temperature has risen at an average of 0.17 degrees Fahrenheit per decade, about 1.5 degrees since 1930. If you look at this chart, you'll see that the increase in St. Louis has been steeper than both at the planetary scale and the national scale. Why is that? I think you know the answer. As my colleague Amy Dunlap mentioned, it's because cities make their own climate in a way that makes them hotter than surrounding areas. This is a map that's similar to the one that you just saw, but this is a composite of 30 years of temperature data that plots the surface temperatures across the metropolitan area, and you can see here what you saw in that last slide, the concentration of heat in the most densely built parts of the metropolitan area. This particular map provided courtesy of Quinn Pilardi at the University of Missouri, Columbia, so I thank him for that private domestic use. However, 2023 survey, very recent, showed that just the fact that one has air conditioning doesn't mean it is protecting you or providing the relief that's needed. As you can see, 19% of older adult homeowners reported at least one 6-hour failure of central air in the previous year, and among African Americans, the figure was 25%. Same survey, 28% of respondents experienced some discomfort, even when the air conditioning was functioning, meaning that it wasn't functioning very well in most cases. So the way that translates into health impacts is the way we see the distribution of deaths skew in recent extreme heat episodes. So there are a lot less deaths since the advent of air conditioning, but concentrated in poorer areas and predominantly in St. Louis, predominantly African American neighborhoods. As you can see in this graphic that comes from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch of the deaths in the 2012 heat waves, and you can see the concentration north of Highway 44. And when we dig down and see what's exactly going on and why these deaths occurred, in many cases, it's people who had air conditioning and who either didn't use them, and in many cases, that's because people are concerned about the high cost of utility bills, or the air conditioning was malfunctioning in some way. These kinds of disparities that we see on this map might suggest a remedy that guarantees equitable access to air conditioning. And this is a laudable goal. Without question, air conditioning has saved lives, but not without some cost to the environment and the social vitality of cities. For one thing, air conditioners don't really manufacture cold. They transfer heat from one place to another. And at the same time that they cool interiors, they also spew hot air into the outdoor environment, thus amplifying the urban heat island effect. And of course, air conditioners historically have been powered by fossil fuels in the form of electricity, which contribute to the planetary increase in temperature. But a reliance on mechanical refrigeration has also made it harder to fall back on those free-of-charge coping strategies that made use of the natural environment in the past. No one sleeps in parks anymore. The practice was abandoned in the 1980s, well before air conditioning was ubiquitous, but at a point when enough home units were owned to deprive parks of the critical population mass required to assure public safety. And so it was fear of crime that induced those without air conditioning, which was half the population, to take refuge in their baking homes. So perhaps we should not be so quick to forsake some of the older methods of coping that have fallen by the wayside. The demise of overnight park sleeping is only one casualty of a climate-controlled metropolis that keeps people increasingly isolated and indoors during hot weather. A few years ago, I was involved in a project that surveyed communities in St. Louis about what sites in their neighborhoods that they most appreciated. And one of the things that we discovered was that people valued spaces that simultaneously accommodated outdoor social encounters and kept them cool. And people, the survey was done by having people take photos of those places they appreciated and then narrating what they thought was special about them. So I'm just going to play two of them just to give you an idea. And that's, oh, I see. So, this is what happens when it's not going to...
This is the fountain on the corner of Flora Place and South Grand. It's a place that my kids and I, when they were younger and it was hot out, we would go on our summer walks. This would always be nice and cool, and we would sit in the shade by the water and relax on the stone benches before we walked back home.
And one more. Oh, not one.
This is the fountain.
We heard that one.
On the corner.
There we go. Listen to...
I come to this park when it's hot because it's the only park over here with a shade area, picnic benches. It don't have a trash can, which promote littering, so it need more trash cans. But it's the place to come when it's cool because it's the only park that got a sun area where the sun don't burn your skin it.
So these photo narrations, of which I'm only sharing two with you, along with this quick review of St. Louis's historical encounters with heat, suggest that reintegrating natural cooling features into our neighborhood landscapes and doing it equitably can not only help people survive, but allow us to preserve and in some cases restore something equally valuable: the outdoor pleasures and social vibrancy of summertime. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Keep your questions in mind for the panel at the end of tonight's event. Our next speaker is Dr. Kaylee Arnold, who is a postdoctoral fellow with the Living Earth Collaborative at Washington University. Dr. Arnold is a disease ecologist and has worked across organismal systems and scales, from insects that contribute to human disease to plants here in St. Louis and the microbes that are interacting with them. And in these systems, she's looking at how human-induced changes to the environment affect disease. Her work is so timely and so cool. So please welcome Dr. Arnold.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you so much for the invitation. I just moved to St. Louis in January, so I'm really excited to start meeting folks and networking and really getting a chance to live and meet everyone in the city. So my title today is The Ecological Impacts of Urban Heat on Human and Wildlife Health. So before I really kind of get into this, I do want to just kind of tell you all a little bit about myself. I think especially with a diverse audience, I like to tell folks how I came to become a disease ecologist. So first, I was born and raised in San Diego, and I went to the University of Redlands. So that was about an hour east of Los Angeles. So there I majored in biology. It was a very small liberal arts school, so there weren't a lot of majors that I could major in. But I was, I think at the time, interested in like medicine or something in that capacity. However, I took a marine ecology class, realized that, I could study the environment and especially marine organisms. I'm from San Diego, so I was like, okay, the rest is history, and I never looked back at medicine. So afterwards, I was a fish technician at Hub's Research Institute. So there, we reared white sea bass, and this was when I got into conservation. work-wise. So we reared white sea bass, and we would put them in holding pens along the coast of the Pacific and California, and then we would eventually release them to help restock the populations of white sea bass. So down from right around the border of Mexico all the way up to Northern California near Oregon. And then so from there, I also, so while I was working full-time, I was volunteering on my days off at the San Diego Zoo. So the San Diego Zoo has two different parks. They have their kind of more traditional zoo in downtown San Diego, and they also have their safari park. So the safari park is about 30 minutes north of San Diego, and there, they do more conservation research, they do a lot of breeding programs, and their enclosures, they're not separated by species, so you'll have like watering holes with lots of your hoofed animals all together. So while I was a volunteer, which is kind of wild that I was doing this as a volunteer part, but I was helping, so once a week for about a year, we would go and collect water around the enclosures, and we would go and sample for pathogens. So this is how I got into wildlife infectious disease work. So we were mostly just looking to see what any emerging pathogens were around the park, anything that we need to be taken to concern. So from there, I kind of deviated a little bit and got my master's at Tulane University, and there I studied fungal endosymbionts of bald cypress trees in the Gulf of Mexico. And then from there, I went on to get my PhD at the Odom School of Ecology, the University of Georgia. So while I was a PhD student, I was really fortunate to be a part of this first cohort of this training ship called Interdisciplinary Disease Ecology Across Scales. So mainly, they're training us across, it took me about 6.5 years to do this degree, so they're training us to study diseases and the environment across different scales of biological organization. So instead of only looking at an organism, we're looking at an organism and then also the populations, the community, landscape level, but then also even down to the molecular level, cellular level, and really understanding how changes to the environment can have impacts on all these different facets of biological organization. And so while I was there, I studied kissing bugs. So this is a photo I took back when I was doing lots of lab and field work. So kissing bug transmits Chagas disease. So my focus, I won't really go into this, but I'm happy to chat with folks afterwards if you're interested in vector-borne diseases. But so we were looking at kissing bugs, and I looked at their gut bacteria. So the species of kiss bugs we looked at live in palm trees. So we were doing some urbanization work and looking at deforestation in urban areas to see if there's any patterns of parasite infection in the bugs and also the gut bacteria. So as I was trying to think about what I was doing next, career-wise, finished my PhD, and I just defended last November, so it's all still pretty fresh. But I was looking at postdoc fellows, and I came across the Living Earth Collaborative. So the Living Earth Collaborative is this really cool center that's collaborations with the Botanical Gardens, the zoo, and the biology department at WashU. And then so as I was exploring folks to work with, I was really interested in kind of taking my research, looking at deforestation and gut microbiomes of insects, and really framing my work into this One Health framework. So if you haven't seen this before, so this is called One Health Framework, and really the biggest idea is that human health, animal health, and environmental health are all inextricably linked, and that in order to fully study and understand and mitigate the impacts of human health, or negative impacts of human health, you must also understand and learn and study environmental health and animal health as well. So let's kind of talk about disease ecology. So I'm your resident disease ecologist for the night. So what is disease ecology? It is the ecology of infectious diseases. So what we study is how does the interactions between hosts and the environment influence what we understand about disease risk and transmission. So here we can think about infectious diseases are strongly influenced by host and parasite community structure. So that would be the number of parasites, the different types of parasites, different types of host species that are in a community, that are in an environment. And then also as influenced by abiotic conditions. So we can think about that as precipitation and temperature. So we're here for urban heat tonight. So now, disease ecology and urban wildlife health has been something that has been studied for several decades. So this is just a meta-analysis. The authors looked at about 106 papers, and all of these papers that they put into their analysis looked at urban and non-urban populations from a single species, and then looked at the conditions of, health conditions. So parasite burden, parasite diversity, body condition of the organisms, also toxins that were in their tissues. So overall, the authors found that urbanization is associated with negative health impacts. So the populations that were in urban areas were more likely to have higher parasites, more likely to have a diverse number of parasites, and also more likely to have toxins. So this is kind of framing my idea about how I think about disease ecology and what I want to study as I go on with my career. So here, we can look at this disease triangle. So this was first published and kind of coined by Stevens in 1960. So kind of bear with me, I'll talk through all the different interactions. But the main idea is that we have our host, the parasite, and the environment that are all linked. Now, again, we're here for heat. So what happens when temperature rises in the environment? So when the environment is changing by rising temperatures. So that can have direct impacts on the parasite in a system. So that can include increased replication of the parasite, maybe changes to the life history and life cycle of the parasite, and then also to the host. So with increased temperatures, body stress, body condition can decrease, behavior and movement can change with different temperatures, and where they're moving, migration patterns are all altered with changes in temperature. And then also we can think about the interaction between the parasite and the host. So if behavior of the host is changing, it may be encountering different parasites, maybe a larger number of parasites. If the parasite is replicating in the host's body, maybe quicker, shedding more, that's going to have an impact on transmission, on mortality, survival of these hosts. So think a lot about the interactions between parasite that's affected by temperature as well as the host. So now kind of expanding this triangle, thinking about community ecology. So in addition to just the parasite and what happens with increased heat, we can also think about parasite community composition. So how many parasites are in the system? What different types of parasites are now in the system with changing temperatures? Some parasites may be more or less able to kind of survive and replicate, reproduce in greater temperatures. And then same thing with host community. So how do changing temperatures impact all the different hosts that are in an ecosystem? Again, some organisms, particularly ectotherms, organisms that cannot regulate their body temperature, they're really sensitive to changes in temperature. So how does raising temperatures have an impact on the overall community of hosts? You may have more hosts in the system, but you also may have fewer hosts. And then again, thinking about the interaction between the parasite community and the host community. So if we're having changing parasite communities, how's that having an impact on the overall host community? So if we're having changes in which hosts are available in the system, that may have an impact on which parasites are able to infect them, and so that can also change the diversity of the parasites as well. And then lastly, when we have changes to the parasite community or changes to the host community, that can have impacts on the overall environment. You can particularly think about biodiversity. If the host community structure is altered because of increased mortality, that can have an impact on the environment and the different organisms that are using the environment. And also you can think about predator-prey dynamics and how that overall affects the environment and the environment health. So I'm going to kind of just talk about this disease triangle once more in the context of vector-borne disease transmission, largely because I studied kissing bugs for nearly 7 years. So I'm hoping this will kind of put everything I said in a little bit more context that we can think about. So first, what are disease vectors? So disease vectors are organisms that spread disease. So that can be mosquitoes, ticks, kissing bugs, fleas, and they're responsible for 17% of all infectious diseases. And that can include transmission of malaria, Chagas disease, guinea worm, Lyme disease, etc. So I won't talk too much about Chagas disease, but I'm happy to chat with y'all later. But so Chagas disease is found throughout the Americas, including the US. So it is transmitted by kissing bugs or triatomines. They're related to assassin bugs or stink bugs. And then Chagas disease is caused by Trypanosoma parasite, so Trypanosoma cruzi. So now let's go back to this disease triangle. So again, we have increasing heat in the environment. So how does that have an impact on the parasite, but also the vector? So I'll kind of expand that corner to both parasite and vector. So now vectors are, again, ectotherms. They're very sensitive to changes in temperature. So with increasing temperatures, that may have an impact on the abundance of the vectors. Maybe they're reproducing more often, more frequently. Also, increasing replication rates of the parasite. So if you have increasing temperatures, what is the parasite abundance going to look like in the communities? Also, what is the abundance of the vectors going to look like in these communities? And then furthermore, movement, shifts in host range, the vector ranges. And even the parasite ranges. So where are they able to persist? Where are they able to move? And then we have, again, the host. So the host, so here's an opossum. We found these a lot in my study system. Kissing bugs love feeding on opossums. So also changes to the temperature can have an impact on the body condition of the host, the behavior of these hosts. Also can make them sick. So now what is this interaction between host and the parasite and the vector when we're increasing temperatures? So you may have increased contact rates if the vector is biting more frequently in these increased temperatures. How's that going to have an impact on transmission? If the parasite is replicating quicker and shedding more often, there may be more hosts that are infected with the parasite as the insect goes on to bite more individuals. And so this will be the last part of this section. So host community. So one thing I did not mention, but so kissing bugs are obligate blood feeders. So that means at every life stage, they feed on blood, and both male and female feed on blood. And then also, kissing bugs will feed on any type of vertebrate. However, only mammals are competent hosts. So if an infected kissing bug feeds on a bird or reptile, the parasite will not persist, and the parasite will not continue its life cycle to then go on to, contribute to the transmission of Chagas disease. However, mammals do. So this is particularly important when we're thinking about if temperature changes the host composition, how does that have an impact on transmission? If increasing temperatures is driving out reptiles, there's, again, also ectotherms and sensitive to temperature changes. And then the kissing bugs are only feeding on mammals or maybe fewer reptiles. That's going to have an increase in transmission and amplify transmission. So all of this is very important to thinking about just how does temperature have an impact on all these different aspects and what that means for transmission, disease risk, and then also, importantly, what that means for humans. So I talked about vector-borne diseases, so these kissing bugs also feed on humans. So when we're changing the host, or when the host communities are changed due to rising temperatures or due to other aspects of urbanization, what does that ultimately mean for humans and public health? All right, so I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about some of the stuff that I'm starting to work on now that I'm in St. Louis. So, plantago and powdery mildew. Just a quick question, does anyone know plantago, or have seen plantago, or powdery mildew on any gardens or any plants? I'm sure a lot of y'all, if you just go take a walk in Forest Park, you'll see lots of infected plantago. So I definitely hope that y'all sometime, the next couple weeks, just take a nice walk, see what you find. I took this photo just really close to where I live in Central West End. So tons of infection. So again, I'm a Living Earth Collaborative Fellow, and so I want to kind of take it back to this One Health framework, however, expanding it just a little bit. So we have our environmental health, human health, and animal health. However, we can't forget plant health. So this is a big part of the research that I'm starting to work on here in St. Louis, is thinking about how is plant health connected to human health, animal health, and environmental health, and kind of ultimately what does that mean and what can we do with this information. So I have 3 lovely advisors as a fellow. So I do want to definitely shout out Dr. Danielle Lee and then also Dr. Sony Aldersinson. And I'm also working with Rachel Pinchakowski. So for the past 10 months, I've been doing most of my kind of applied research in the Pinchakowski lab. So this is what I'll sort of talk about right now. So Dr. Pinchakowski and all of her grad students have been doing awesome work way before I came here. And their overarching goal is to understand how wild plant populations and their pathogens respond to urbanization. So in the lab, we use common lawn weeds, plantago, and fungal pathogens to look at these dynamics. So we study 2 different species of plantago. We have blackseed plantain, which is the native plantago, and then we also have ribwort plantain, which is, has been introduced to North America. So why study weeds? Why study plantago? Most people are trying to get rid of it, and we're trying to grow it and study it. So they're easy to find. Like I said, you can just go ahead and walk outside. You'll see plenty of plantago. They're found in disturbed habitats. They're really hard to kill, which for us studying pathogen dynamics are happy about. You can find them in sidewalks and pastures, truly everywhere. So that makes studying urbanization easy because you can find these at so many different areas. Also, so they're native and introduced species that we're studying, so we can look at a little bit of these different dynamics. They've been very, very well studied, so it's a perfect model system for us. And also they're food for caterpillars and other pests. So in addition to pathogen dynamics, we can also study pest dynamics. So how does urbanization have an impact on what's feeding on these plants? And then also, so powdery mildews, right? I saw a couple of hands for powdery mildew. I'm sure all of y'all are also don't love powdery mildew. However, we do, and it's a great thing to study. So it's a group of fungal pathogens that produce white powdery spores on leaves. So different plant species can have different powdery mildew pathogens. So we can look at different dynamics and different evolution and adaptation. It's really easy to spot. In my previous work, it was really hard to know if an insect was infected or not. Here, I can just go ahead and take a look, take a photo, and I know if a plant is infected or not. So in the lab, they study plantago mildew interactions across urbanization gradient in the St. Louis region. So for the past 5 years, Dr. Pinchakowski's former grad student, Dr. Quinn Fox, and then now I will be continuing these surveys, have been studying 22 parks along this gradient. So if you can see with this photo, all the yellow dots are our rural parks. The kind of green dots in the middle are our suburban parks. And then finally, we have our urban parks. And so our furthest site is out at Gray Summit, at Shaw Nature Reserve, and then our kind of like most eastward site is a few parks in North City. So this ordination, this is really just showing the differences in these like metrics of urbanization. So this was definitely before my time, before I came to St. Louis, but Pinchakowski and her students looked at all these different parks and looked at percent impervious surfaces in the areas, human density, percent tree cover, nightlife, temperature. And so they found that all of these parks are separating pretty clearly between the different types of habitats that they're in. So we have our rural parks, that's all the yellow. They're quite spread away, so that means they have quite different amount of percent tree cover and impervious surfaces, for example. And then we have our suburban and our urban sites. These ones are overlapping just a little bit more. And I think something to think about is that U City, for example, is a suburban site, but U City is like kind of maybe urban suburban-ish. In contrast to maybe some of our West County sites that maybe feel a little bit more kind of clear-cut suburban. So we're going to have some maybe a little bit overlapping, but there still is a clear difference. So we can look at plants along this gradient. So you've seen this image before. So what are we doing with all of this? So urban heat islands and microclimate variation impact plant interactions with microbes and herbivores. So of course we have our heat island, so urban heat island. And then also, we can think about microclimate variation. So this is one of the parks that we sample, and you can see that there's a lot of shade. You have a sidewalk and a grassy area. So this may be in an urban park and maybe one of the hotter parts of the city, but you're gonna have different temperatures when you're in the shade versus not, as well as if you're more on the sidewalk versus if you're in the grass or under trees. So what Rachel and Dr. Fox found is that larger epidemics are in more urban populations. So again, we surveyed Plantago, both species, along 22 parks in this urbanization gradient. So they consistently found more mildew infection on Plantago in more urban populations and shaded microhabitats. So you can see primarily on the bottom panel, so that's Plantago regelii. We're seeing large epidemics. So the purple are our urban parks. You can see greater percentage of plants that are infected. And then also the shade, you can see that on your right. Also, you're seeing larger percentage of infection. So this is really just showing is that we're having large epidemics in more urban populations and more shaded microhabitats. So why made me see this? So the urban heat island effect may have enhanced pathogen overwinter survival in these urban populations. So perhaps in these kind of urban, more hotter cities, the pathogen is not completely dying off and is able to persist through the winter and then kind of persist once the plants grow back. Also, warmer temperatures during the early summer may have promoted mildew growth and transmission. So again, maybe just the temperatures are helping to increase growth rates of the fungal pathogen. And then finally, human density. So urban sites may just be more connected with roadways. So we're talking about fungal spores. So they're spread by wind, they're spread by people walking around, animals walking around. So perhaps that's contributing more so in the urban areas to transmission. And then also, so we saw a difference in shaded. So it's likely we're still doing some work, but that shaded habitats provide refuge from strong UV and temperatures. So perhaps there is a thermal max that's in our urban parks in the sun that the pathogen cannot persist or will not grow as quickly as in the shaded areas, which are a little bit cooler. So some further questions in the lab is why do we see larger pathogen epidemics in more urban plant populations? So really trying to get at the mechanisms and sort of like what is driving these patterns. How do wild plant populations and their pathogens adapt to urbanization? If you take a seedling from a rural park and you plant it in an urban park, how will those pathogen dynamics play out? Is it going to be more or less adapted to pathogens that we're finding? The mildew finding in the urban environments, maybe just urban spaces make plants grow and have more infections regardless of where they came from. So how does microclimate impact susceptibility to disease and herbivory? Again, thinking about these differences in shaded versus non-shaded areas. And then this is a bit of my bread and butter, so I'm happy to chat with y'all at dinner, maybe a little bit afterwards, but how do leaf-associated microbiomes differ across an urbanization gradient? So I'm kind of a microbial ecologist in addition to disease ecologist, so I'm currently been sampling all over these parks this past about 4 months, and so I'm going to eventually look at the overall patterns of bacterial, fungal, even virus communities. Are there differences in the overall diversity of parasites, of microbes in urban spaces versus rural spaces? Does that maybe contribute to those differences in susceptibility, differences in these epidemic patterns? So just some final thoughts. So infectious diseases are strongly influenced by host community composition, parasite diversity, and especially abiotic conditions. And then finally, disease ecology can provide a framework for understanding disease transmission dynamics in urban systems. And that's when we're looking at interactions between the host, the parasite, and the environment. And thank you.
Thank you, Kaylee. We're now going to break for dinner and conversation. Dinner is just downstairs. If you weren't able to register for dinner, just hang back. There's probably going to be a sandwich for you. And then we're going to return here just a little bit after 8 for our final speaker, Stephen Duong, and then we're going to have a Q&A with our speakers up here on the stage. So thank you all. Welcome back. Everybody got quiet. All right, our final speaker is Stephen Duong. Stephen's a certified planner and a principal with AECOM. Is that how you say that, AECOM? Oh, he can tell us. Overseeing the urbanization and planning practice for the firm's West region. Stephen focuses on urban resilience, smart cities, and master planning, and is super active in his field. He's also received a number of accolades, both nationally and in his home base of Dallas. So please welcome Mr. Duong.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be following up my two preceding speakers because we are going to zoom in and out of both those topics during mine today. I am going to open with, I have on here Phoenix on the slide. That's mostly because it's the easiest example that I can show that is basically a hot doomscape of the universe. But we are going to flip topics between St. Louis and Phoenix going forward, and kind of the work I've been doing, the work we've been seeing across the US and parts of the world, and how it relates to urban heat, urban morphology, and kind of the history and trajectory of our cities and communities. So going to go right into it. So the first thing is, I want a show of hands for those in the room. Who here is familiar with generally city planning, urban planning, neighborhood planning, and how all that works? Like those of you who raised it, like half did it too. So like I'm gonna count it as like 7.5 folks in the room raise their hand. So I'm going to start back a little bit and give an introduction of, I would say, my theory on this presentation a little bit was, this is ordinarily how we think about cities and communities and how we plan them, and try to tie it back to where we usually end up in our conversations with the topic of urban heat. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how various folks have been trying to take that idea, that analysis much further, so we can actually do something about it, or at least get as close as we can to incentivizing our policy leaders to do something about it. So again, my name is Steven. I lead a ragtag group of nerds at an architecture firm called AECOM, where we call ourselves Urbanism Plus Planning, and we are not a traditional designers in the sense that we focus on building buildings or places. We primarily operate on kind of urban strategy. So we try and meld together design with urban policy. That's generally where we do most of our work. And so what that means is that we end up doing a bunch of really fun projects, like we write a lot of climate action plans. We do a lot of infrastructure analysis for governments and cities. We do energy modeling, we do economic real estate analysis, and a whole sorts of lots of different types of questions that you typically need to kind of address city building and how you work and operate in communities. So this has taken us to, I would say, generally as a group of far-flungs of the world, we've been working on urban heat and related issues in New Zealand, in Canada, in France and other parts, but also a lot of cities in the US, including Phoenix, which is going to be part of my case study today. So one of the reasons why I'm here is my great friend and colleague, Catherine Werner, and I are working with St. Louis County in conjunction with a similar parallel effort at the city of St. Louis on updating what the county is calling their equitable and sustainable master plan. So this is meant to be the long-range guiding document for the future of the county that is meant to work in conjunction with documents for the city that basically says, okay, where we really want to be at in 2050 as a region, and what does it really take to actually get there? Now, I am new to this region, and so I am very much learning on the fly and have been instructed by a certain cohort of students in the room about 10 minutes ago that if I don't have toasted ravioli, I have completely messed up. So that is to say, the fact that I hesitate to say that is how rookie I am here. So please take what I'm about to say with some grain of salt, but I'm giving my perspective here on what we're thinking about in terms of the St. Louis region. So for those of you who aren't familiar with how planning and urban design works, generally it starts with a conversation like what I've got here on the screen. So this is a classic map that we would say it's the land use map of St. Louis County in particular. I didn't include the city on one because I would have had to make another slide and I had this one ready, sorry. So we would start with, okay, what is the real urban morphology of St. Louis here? Where has development historically occurred? Where is it going to occur? All sorts of questions like that. How dense is it? How rural is it, et cetera. We would often extend this kind of analysis to lots of really interesting questions. For instance, is the growth and the pattern of the city done in a sustainable way? And when I say sustainable, I mean not only environmentally sustainable, but also fiscally sustainable, socially sustainable, and other critical elements that ensures kind of the continuity of our cities and communities. So for instance, one of the questions that we're being asked to look at for St. Louis County is, does the makeup of the county as an entity in the larger St. Louis region make sense from an economic sustainability perspective? Are they generating enough tax base to literally keep the lights on in the region? And so these are the types of questions that we will often dive into. And then what we really end up doing is we start to develop really high-level guidance on different strategies and what we can do about it. For instance, on one hand, we might dive into economic development questions, and sometimes we might dive into, let's say, infrastructure equity questions. So one of the things we might be doing, I say might, we will be doing, is really diving into the racial distribution of assets such as roadways and public transportation amongst vulnerable populations. And so it's a really wide-ranging process when you're thinking about city planning, right? You have to cover tons of different factors, lots of different voices, lots of different ideas, and try and coalesce them into some cohesive strategy that says, we're hoping our city and community ends up this way aspirationally over the long haul. So as part of that work, one thing we always typically do is a lot of climate modeling and sustainability work into the process. So this is just an example of a model I did recently. I am from Dallas, but we are intending to do this also here in our work in the St. Louis region, which is where we investigate hundreds of different urban policy questions, and we model them in lots of different interesting ways, including their contributions to sustainability, urban heat, and other climate-related measures. So for instance, we would take a look at certain policies and say, what is its contribution to, let's say, this region achieving, for instance, the Paris Accords goals of controlling emissions and temperature rises to a certain degree. Once we do this kind of modeling work, we write policies, and what typically happens in kind of these large plans is that we would end up with something, I would say, somewhat high level and common that would be a recommendation policy that looks like what I've got on the screen here. So what it says on the screen here is, in case you can't read it, increase and improve access to green spaces, particularly within vulnerable communities, to reduce the impact of urban heat island, localized flooding, and improve public health. Obviously, that is an incredibly loaded statement and means 100 different things would have to occur. And oftentimes, that's just the way the city planning process goes, because you're trying to achieve and say so much in a somewhat compressed amount of time, and you need to set kind of your targets in a vague but concrete enough way that we know what we kind of want to do, but the pathway to actually get there is always quite difficult. I pulled this example out because this is a very common recommendation in most US cities these days, which is explicitly trying to tangle and in some ways disentangle the linkage between urban development, urban heat, quality of life, air quality, and a whole bunch of other factors that affect people on a day-to-day basis. Because if you think about the term that you might often hear, sustainable development, it often refers to compact, walkable urban forms, right? So here, we're on Del Mar, walkable. A lot of people would think that's a good thing, and if you did that more, what happens? You end up with more dense, compact cities, right? If you are trying to achieve certain principles of sustainable development. But compact cities also means more concrete, more thermal mass, more solar reflection, higher ambient temperatures, and poor air quality. So we've got these kind of ideas that are, I would say, accepted globally around what is sustainable development. How do we achieve it? People want to be able to walk instead of drive. We want to have access to lots of amenities around us, but still live a really comfortable life, right? But we have to negotiate this tension with, generally, urbanism itself, as very well noted on the map earlier, lends itself to certain negative externalities, such as increases in ambient air temperature. So how do we negotiate this? And really importantly, how do we start to understand a little bit more detail of what can we do about it, how to prioritize, how much does it cost, and how do we actually do this? And so this is the part where I kind of often say, the important question for us often is what's next? Like we've set this really ambitious target, this goal, what do we do now? So now we transport ourselves to Mars, also known as Phoenix. Now, I will go ahead and say, I Googled this image. I literally just typed in hot Phoenix. So I can't really say if this image is augmented or not. It kind of looks it, but for the sake of ourselves, let's just agree in this room together that it's hot. So that is their primary baseline of understanding for this conversation going forward. It's hot. So has anyone here been to Phoenix? Okay, I'm gonna pick a couple people in the room. You totally raised your hand, didn't you? Sorry, I'm gonna pick on you first. Okay, give me like one word that you think about Phoenix. I'm not gonna, is this being recorded? I'm just kidding. I'm not gonna debate that one. Someone else who's been to Phoenix, raise your hand. Give me a word. Dry. All right, one more. Hot. Okay, so we've gotten to hellscape, hot, and dry. Great, those are pretty much the answers I was expecting on what Phoenix is like. So the other side of Phoenix is it is growing absurdly fast. It's one of the fastest growing parts in the US, right? Headline after headline after headline. I love these. It's like Phoenix, hottest, least sustainable city, is also top destination for movers. Rapid growth magnified its vulnerability to heat. It is growing like gangbusters. It is a hellscape, just to be clear, and hot and dry, and everyone's still moving there. And so the question that a lot of folks always ask is, why do people keep moving there, and why is it growing when it's what we just described? I'm not going to say hellscape again. I was trying to think of a more creative alternative version to that. But it is a somewhat hostile place to live, right? I think we can agree to that. So what we ran into is that Phoenix itself prides itself immensely on being very strong in terms of economic development. They focus a lot of their energy, a lot of their investment into driving economic growth in the region, attracting businesses, developing subsidized cheap housing, AKA suburbs, and lots of other things that really cause the region to really grow quickly. On the other hand, they fully recognize, spoiler, that it is hot. So we were asked to kind of think about the idea of urban heat in Phoenix and start to reframe the conversation. Because when we think about, when a lot of folks, policymakers in Phoenix talk about urban heat, and you start talking about what can we do about it, what they would say is dealing with urban heat is hard, it's expensive, we don't know how much it really makes a difference, and look, have you seen these headlines? We're growing anyways. And so what we had to do was try and reframe the conversation to say, okay, you're growing really rapidly despite the heat there. But what if you turn the question and said, how much growth are you actually leaving on the table because a lot of folks don't want to move here despite it being a rapid growing place because it is so hot? So now instead of talking about dealing with urban heat as a question of how much does it cost and how much does it benefit us, we're changing the question to what are you actually missing out on because you haven't dealt with it? And if we take that a step further, our question is, can we quantify that in a way so that, let's say, a city council or county commission or economic development board could say, actually, we are missing out competitively on amenities, on other things for people because we haven't dealt with heat. That's kind of the underlying premise of our work there, is to kind of reframe the conversation towards solutions, but also make it less about how much does it cost to solve this problem. This is a classic issue in climate action planning, right? It seems unsurmountable. The costs are outrageous. But when you flip it into what we often call a cost of inaction study, suddenly you're like, wait. I mean, yeah, it's expensive, but the other outcome is existential doom for humanity. Like, one is clearly more affordable than the other. And so that's kind of the framework that we approach this process. So what it means is that we took a look at Phoenix and we did a climate conditions analysis. I'll go into this a little bit more. And then we took a long-term forecast of changing, we used several different global climate models across the world, and we modeled against both the targets by the Paris Accord and also kind of a business as usual case. And so once we kind of understood future forecasted heat and climate conditions in Phoenix, we then translate it back to, okay, what is the cost of an action of not doing anything to deal with urban heat? And then finally, how do we quantify that in a way that we can talk about what kind of solutions actually make sense for us to deploy to solve this issue? So I'm going to start with the climate conditions analysis. So what we did is we took a two-time horizon approach, 2030 and 2050. we took the two kind of common accepted climate targets, what we call RCP 4.5 and 8.5. Translation, 8.5 is effectively a somewhat do business as usual business case, so effectively our governments and otherwise continue the process as is in our cities. The 4.5 is a much more aggressive action in dealing with climate change, emissions, et cetera. So we've got these two time horizons, and we've got two different kind of evaluations of climate. And then we ran that through also 10 global climate models, and we basically kind of translated to what does this mean specifically for the Phoenix region in terms of climate patterns. So once we had that, we then said, okay, we have a decent grip on what we expect the long-term forecast of Phoenix's climate pressures to be, what are their biggest weaknesses, et cetera. Now we want to understand what is the cost of inaction. Now, I'm going to preface this with that cost of inaction on something like urban heat is so incredibly complicated and intricate because heat impacts so many different things, so many different ways, with tons of different downstream externalities that are just quite frankly impossible to calculate. So what we did instead was we picked, in working in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy, ASU, the local governments, et cetera, we picked 5 kind of target indicators that we said, okay, urban heat, it's way too complex, but we can try and narrow down 5 different categories that folks really care about, try to understand a little bit better. So that is increased mortality, morbidity, labor to productivity impacts, I'm gonna go into that a little bit more, shortened life cycle of roadway infrastructure, and critical services energy demand. So you can kind of see this is a sliver of the broader impacts of urban heat, but it is something that we can actually start to evaluate, and these indicators in particular inform a lot of urban development and urban policy in the Phoenix region. So we spent a great deal of time with the folks at ASU and the Nature Conservancy to try and work through all the literature and say, okay, these are at least acceptable methods of calculating the impacts of these various measures, because sometimes there's complicated stuff that, quite frankly, is very difficult to talk about. For instance, mortality. What is the cost of a human life? If you're talking about increased human deaths, as we talked about, due to urban heat, and if you really had to put that into an economic lens, how do you put the price on human life? That is a rather unreasonable process. But in this case, we worked with the federal government, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, others, and they actually, in the federal government, have various calculations that they sort of use as rules of thumb for, let's say, the value of a life. It's approximately $13 million or so, last I checked. And so, not perfect, but something we can work off of, right? So we did that for all of these metrics, and we ran it through a cost of inaction against these climate models. And effectively what we got was a totality of economic burden that the Houston-Phoenix region effectively carries due to inaction against urban heat. So the totality you can see under the business as usual scenario is a little over $2 billion worth of just of these specific metrics, $2 billion worth of negative impact in the region. Now, the reason this is important for us is because if we are trying to work with policymakers and others to say it is worth investing, let's say, in pocket parks and other landscape coverage and other types of strategies to deal with urban heat, oftentimes it's going to be is too expensive. So we at least have to start to say, okay, not doing something leads to something, and it will cost you something to do something. We can at least start to work ourselves closer to a benefit cost analysis. So after getting these figures of the cost of impact of heat, we then started to investigate several different strategies to deal with urban heat. I've highlighted 2 here. The first is cool roofs. The second is urban tree canopy. Urban tree canopy is probably the most common one that folks talk about. Cool roofs is also another common one. Under both of these kind of solutions, we made a couple of really high-level assumptions working with the local metropolitan planning organization. So for cool roofs, we assume, in a magical world, we assume 100% cool roof implementation in the entire county by 2050. So that's new development. So we took a look at their growth models, their land use model, their urban development models. We modeled it out for their new growth and retrofits for their older homes and said, okay, let's just assume in some world we can get to 100% cool roofs. And then on the urban tree canopy, we said, okay, let's assume we've got 25% canopy coverage in the county, which is a substantial increase from what they have now. But this was a aggressive but quote unquote achievable targets set by the regional government there. So those are kind of the parameters of what we investigated there. And then amongst a bunch of our solutions, some are region-wide, some are site-specific. Some you can only deploy on a home, on a specific site. Some you can just say it's going to be policy for the whole region. So taking into that account, we do a benefit cost analysis. Not going to go into that if you really feel like you want to learn more about benefit cost analysis, because nighttime reading. Feel free to Google it. But long story short is we're taking a look at what does it really cost to do it versus what is the benefit, and get to some ratio that effectively gets to a number that a lot of elected officials and policymakers like, which is for every dollar spent in this, you get X dollars benefit. It's not perfect, but it is very useful for a lot of folks to just understand, is this a good investment or not? And so that's kind of the target strategy we took here, which is after doing our energy modeling and way too much work, 100% cool roofs effectively comes out to be pretty good. It's a 5.2-ish benefit cost ratio. So every dollar the government would spend on helping folks adapt to urban heat through a cool roof strategy, they're effectively reducing their long-term cost burden in a region by $5 for every dollar. Now, this ignores the complexity of like having to ask developers to do it, and there's lots of complexity in implementation. But the broad narrative is that it's actually very quote-unquote profitable for Phoenix to consider being very deliberate about dealing with urban heat. Same thing with the tree canopy coverage. Now, tree canopy coverage, some folks would argue that it probably deserves to be higher because there's a bunch of stuff that's harder to calculate, like the increase in real estate value by having a lot of landscape that makes your property look more attractive and amenable and those sorts of things. But broadly speaking, also very strategically good investment to increase your tree canopy. So we've got these kind of initial numbers, this initial framework for what we're trying to do and what we're trying to solve for. And we ran this kind of analysis across a lot of different tools that you could do to mitigate urban heat. Some of them are easier to quantify than others, but the idea was to start to give folks, if you had to prioritize some limited investment on how to deal with urban heat, these are probably the ones you should start with. So now the next step for us really comes to, okay, what's next? How are we going to actually do this? So the next thing we did is we worked with the Regional Metropolitan Planning Authority of Phoenix, which is called MAG. It's an acronym, of course. And we basically started embedding this analysis and these recommendations in all their policy documents. So the idea is that these regional governments, if you don't know, St. Louis, of course, has one too, have quite a bit of say in how the region grows. Where growth occurs, is the infrastructure in place for that growth to occur in the first place? We just talked about it earlier in the other presentations, that the infrastructure and growth unlocks more growth. So we started embedding these ideas to say, hey, Phoenix, if you keep growing, yes, you're going to keep growing, you get more housing, you get to brag, you also have less water per capita, you are generating more heat to make your region even more difficult to live in, along with a bunch of negative externalities. So this has started prolificating into the regional plans, and now our hope is to actually bring some of this thinking analysis into St. Louis. So I'm going to take us back from the hellscape of Phoenix back to St. Louis and talk a little bit about what we are trying to do in our work over the next few years here. So I started this whole presentation with what do we do in planning? Like, what is our job, effectively? Sorry. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the growth patterns, the morphology, and the physical dimensions of St. Louis County and how it grows. So that means, what do typical houses look like? How much land do they take? How much landscape usually comes with them? We do a bunch of modeling, and that modeling includes how change happens over time. So you might start with some more rural development. Over time, it gets more dense. That means more infrastructure, means more other things come with it. If you're particularly nerdy and inclined, what we do is we do a gravity model. So as development occurs, the gravity model gets a heavier weight and attracts more development. So for those of you who are more inclined, you get the picture. So we do a bunch of modeling, and then we basically do a bunch of scenarios. And what we say is, okay, there's probably infinite pathways for St. Louis to grow, right? But depending on which policies you in place, there are probably 5 to 10 trajectories of growth that are more likely. So this is the part where I basically sound like ChatGPT, and I say we run a bunch of this analysis through a bunch of machine learning techniques to basically model and simulate futures hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. Then we Monte Carlo model it to basically say, okay, these are probably the pathways of future St. Louis that are most likely to occur if you pull these certain policy triggers. So we do a bunch of model, and that leads us to everything from things like, okay, depending on how we develop, we should probably start thinking about adjusting our development code in St. Louis to reflect certain goals that we have. So we do a bunch of modeling, we do a bunch of design work. Kind of see on the right here, we basically do these and run them, and we get a bunch of numbers and analysis that basically says, okay, generally, these might be how these different futures of St. Louis perform, including things like emissions and urban heat. Once we have the totality of those different options and the policies that really matter, we then go back to policy and elected officials and say, okay, if you really want to achieve certain goals in the St. Louis region by X date, these are the 20 policies that actually have a bigger influence in changing the outcome. The rest are really important too. They're great, but they will probably likely move the needle less. And so we're trying to get to a point is that, building communities and cities is really complicated, right? It's mostly a mixture of organic, natural occurrences mixed in with some futile attempt at using policy to control our fates, but we try. And the biggest thing is that it's so overwhelming that you don't really know where to start to make an impact sometimes because policy is so kind of vague and can be nebulous at times. It's often definitely very esoteric. So we try and give some priorities. We develop these kind of future scenarios, and then we basically try and summarize in a way that if you have goals 1 through 10 as a region, we think these are really important, and we will assemble it into a future plan for the county. And our hope is to do this whole process and have it done in the next about year and a half for St. Louis County, and the city of St. Louis is also concurrently running their own process. So our hope is that these kind of move together, that we understand policy and urban development and its thereby impacts to climate together, and that by the end of this whole process, we have a good feel for some level of consensus that people have certain desires they want to see here in St. Louis. They agree on some core fundamental processes and principles that we want to achieve, and these are, generally speaking, the most important pathways we can take as communities of St. Louis to actually get there. So that's kind of the hope. This is my extremely shameless moment to say that we're starting this process really soon. And if you get a mail or flyer about it, please come. 1, you get to see me. But 2, also, you get to contribute to the process. We are going to be doing crazy fun stuff where we have digital maps, and you can actually do a bunch of this analysis with us to experiment, to see with us on the fly how this stuff plays out, because it's nuts. So yeah, that's my shameless plug. Starting up, it'll probably be in the news, and people will find out how to get in touch. So that's all to say that I'm going to close with fully recognizing that urban heat is an extremely complicated beast, and especially if you are a non-bi-coastal city, aka not the New York, San Franciscos of the world, which whenever they talk about climate change, it's usually 1A, 1B, 1C is usually flood and sea level rise. For the rest of us in the US, usually it's flooding, heat, and hail, and tornadoes, and other similar things. Those are things because we don't have same issues. And those topics of kind of resilience shocks are much less studied than sea level rise. And that has been a problem, is that a lot of the climate work has a strong bias towards coastal metropolitan centers. So we're hoping that this effort and a lot of our work in places like Phoenix and Chicago and elsewhere starts to kind of rebalance our understanding of long-term climate impacts across all American cities and contexts, as opposed to purely a bi-coastal perspective. So yeah, Phoenix, hot. We're trying to do something about it, and we've kind of figured some things that make sense. That's a wrap from me. Do I go down? Sit.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd now like to invite all 3 of our speakers back up to the stage for our panel. And I'd like to invite all of you to ask your questions of our excellent speakers. All right.
Musical chairs.
microphone for all of you. Do we have the tossable one? So if you have a question, we have this red box that's made out of foam that we will toss to you, and you can speak into the box, and everyone will be able to hear your question.
Yep.
And then you can toss it to the next person.
Okay. Give me one moment to go turn on their mic. 'Cause
All right.
I forgot to.
So I hope you're all thinking of your questions.
Yes. We're back.
Oh, all right. Who would like to ask the first question? Anyone? Oh, here we are, over here with Liz. You can see how much you want to catch that. All right.
Okay, what we heard a lot of was about a lot of negatives about heat. I was wondering if there isn't, kind of on all things, some positives that that are also gonna, I guess in a way, is more about the plants and animals and things. Is there certain plants and animals and creatures that are more resilient? Are we seeing some benefits coming from the changing climate?
So I don't have any specific examples right now. I'll have to kind of think about that. But a big part of a little bit what I was trying to touch on today is maybe some like mismatch between parasites and their hosts. So I think it's very possible that there are scenarios where a parasite heat will like decrease its efficiency, and then you'll have maybe fewer parasites. I know with our plant system, we kind of showed that perhaps temperatures that are too high are decreasing the growth of the fungal pathogen. So we can kind of think about that as that. But just so even in like hot areas, that there may be some, like positive mismatches with the parasite. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. I wish I had something more specific to tell you, but yeah, and definitely with insects, there are some kind of like host, temperature max, and they can't travel as much. So yeah, but thank you for your question.
So I don't like shoveling snow. So I will be very grateful for warmer winters and not having to, as I get older, do all those arduous things related to snow. Yes, of course, there are some good things about more heat, but I think that the issue is to think about this. It's not what's good about heat, what's bad about heat. It's to think about how the disruption of a significant change in the environmental context in which we operate. And to think about cities are built over time and have been built in relationship to a climate, which may vary from place to place. So when you have in a relatively short amount of time, a dramatic change in that climatic context, that is going to be disruptive, whether you're heading towards heat or whether you're heading towards cold. So it's not so much, good heat, bad heat versus cold. It's the rate of change and the challenges that poses to adapting cities to another climatic context.
I'm up? Okay. Okay, cool. So in the graphic about cool roofs versus tree coverage, unless I read it wrong, what cool roofs looked like it was a considerably cheaper option. What makes the trees so expensive?
Oh man, is this work? Okay, so there's a lot that goes into it. So one, cool roofs, there are a lot of really, quite frankly, cheap ways to augment a roof to be more reflective and cooling. Planting trees in cities is absurdly hard. Like it takes room. You have to have the room for their roots to grow out, and especially in cities that are built out, finding room for a massively increased tree canopy is the same type of question you run into when you're dealing with real estate. There's limited land, and land is expensive. So it's not just as easy as, yes, we can plant trees. It's where to find it, how to find it, and then take care of it. Whereas in some ways, cool roofs, it's more of like, you can paint your roof or do certain treatments to make it cooler. That doesn't require nearly the same intervention that actually planting a tree in a city does.
Oh, go long.
Yep. Go long, go long. Yes.
That was pretty good.
So I've been thinking about urban forestry for the past 25 years, and I would be delighted if once in a while I would get a message from someone that read something about trees, that someone said, hey, I read this thing in the paper about trees. Now I'm getting those messages from friends and family and people almost every day. Did you see that thing in the New York Times? Did you see that thing in the National Geographic? I read this in the Post-Dispatch every day. And always about why trees are maybe one of these solutions. And I mean, you hit the nail on the head with why it's so hard. My question, and really in that what next conversation, is now that we know, we've been doing cost-benefit analyses for decades, we know, what is it that's going to translate to those planners, to those policies, that we can solve some of those more difficult problems in the system of, growing soil volume? Is there a disconnect between people and nature in a way that we're maybe going down the wrong path towards that solution?
I can take the first stab at it. I do think it's I actually feel like there's almost two sides of the question. So you're right. We definitely know the value of trees now. But if you think about it, the places where it's easier for us to deploy, let's say, better tree design standards, let's say, right, are going to be in newer developments, which are typically in the fringe, which is opposed to good sustainable development practice, which is more compact urban infill. In those compact places, it's just the typical classic, it's so hard to do anything in cities at all. It's land constrained, it's expensive, it's hard to maintain, you don't know where everything is. So I've always felt like a lot, so right now, you're probably aware, there as part of the latest round of federal funding, there's the CPRG, I hope I'm getting the acronym right, CPRG, it's a climate grant right now, and hundreds of cities across the U.S. applied for grant money through the CPRG program, specifically to do urban tree coverage expansion. And the reason they had to leverage that grant is because the amounts these cities are asking are upwards of $300, $400, $500 million to increase their tree canopy. So when you start getting into figures that high, very few cities can actually absorb that cost unless you put it on developers to build, which once you put it on a developer to build, you're now quote unquote hurting the bottom line. And unless you mandate it, then you get into weird economic development conversations. So it always feels like one of those things, you're right, we've understood it, and for some reason, we still make it incredibly difficult and expensive to do. I still feel like a lot of it is just literally the space to get the coverage in urban cores.
you're raising your hand, raise it up like high.
Don't raise it all at once.
Well, while you're thinking, I'll weigh in on trees. And, this is not from my historian's hat, but more from some of the community projects I work on. Not everybody likes trees, and so I think there's still a public relations aspect and a need to address some of the popular, lack of a better word, animosity toward trees. And so when we were doing that project that I alluded to, where we asked people to talk about places in their neighborhood that they appreciated, we also asked them to talk about places that they don't appreciate. And in areas of St. Louis that were racially mixed and more economically heterogeneous, there was a great deal of appreciation for trees. We found that was much less the case in lower income areas that were more racially homogenous, where there's a perception of negative perceptions of vegetation and trees as being associated with public safety risks. And then there are also legitimate concerns about if you have, climate change augurs for more violent storms, which means trees present the hazard of power outages. So, there are reasons that have to be dealt with to address some concerns about trees, that not everybody understands trees as the solution.
You actually just reminded me of one more anecdote that I feel like reinforces your point. So we talked about how expensive trees are, and trees are probably one of the best, if not the best, carbon sequestration strategy we have on this planet. Yet you look at the massive amounts of quote-unquote easy funding that air carbon capture startups get, the amount of money they're able to raise could easily pay for a lot of urban tree canopy expansion if it was a policy desire that we actually had. So it does kind of reinforce, I think, to the point, for some reason, we've always got our eyes on other things besides trees, like new technologies that can solve something that a tree has always been able to solve, in terms of carbon sequestration specifically.
Thank you. Thank you so much, the three of you, for just sharing everything you shared, and I think I learned so much today. And I want to acknowledge that climate change is a systemic problem, so I don't want to minimize that, but I was wondering if you have any just advice or recommendation for us. Most of us, at least I don't have like big influence on how my city is planned, like in a direct way, or any like say on like public health and how those things are working, but I do have like my own like sphere of like influence and my own like small community that I interact with. So like, yeah, if you have any recommendations for us, because we already live in this urban heat environment. So yeah, just wanted to hear from you.
Okay. Do you? Okay, I've got a. Oh man, it's such a cop out. Okay, cop out answer. This sounds so. One vote. I feel like this comes up all the time where people are like, oh, what can I do? What can I do? Like, so many things about our cities, they're not accidents, right? Like, oftentimes they're pushed by like natural, organic kind of confluence of forces, but a lot of it's just straight up incidentally or accidentally intentional, if that makes sense. And so when you think about like tree canopy coverage or urban heat or how we build our cities and how dense they are they walkable, where does it happen? Those are actually all things that someone decided. That stuff does not happen accidentally. And folks always ask, certainly in the urban planning sphere, is like, oh, how can I have a voice in where and what this happens? And almost invariably the answer is always like, did you vote on a referendum for someone for public office or some other, did you go to public meetings on new legislation or ordinance about development? And it seems like most of the time folks are like, no. Totally agree also that participating in the public process is extremely like difficult, discriminatory, it's hard, but it is also easily the most probably 1A to 1B pathway to influencing change. Sorry, it was a little bit of a cop-out answer because I just said go vote, but it's also kind of my answer. Anyone else can help me out? Yes.
Oh, Andrea, if you want to toss it back.
Hi. I used to work downtown, and I lived out in the county, and whenever I'd come out, leave off on Highway 40 especially, I would always be able to tell where the heat dropped, right at Warson Road. Have you, in your experience, has that expanded more or become less, or has it extended farther out to the west, for example?
Yes. Yeah, sure. It follows urban development. So yeah, and you know, as you have more impermeable surfaces, road construction, development of roadway systems further out, and also the conversion of natural vegetative space into built materials, and as you know, St. Louis. You know, I used to know these numbers and these statistics, but the St. Louis metropolitan area population has been pretty stagnant for about the last 40 years or so, but yet the amount of space that has been absorbed into has become urbanized, has like tripled. So you do have that urbanized environment that propagates heat has expanded, and yes, it has moved further out.
Here you go. Incoming.
Hello. Okay, so I consider myself a conservationist and a studying biologist, and I have a very big interest in urban conservation. I could go on for hours about car-centric infrastructure and suburbia, but I'm very interested in, Stephen, your work as well with like city planning and sustainability. So I guess my question would be, I feel like sometimes there's a disconnect between like conservation and city planning. For example, I did an internship with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and I learned a lot of depressing things about what's happening and all these recommendations, but they often aren't considered when it comes to city planning. So how can we close that gap, I guess, between city planners and conservationists, or does that already exist? Like, if I'm interested in going into that type of work, like what are there jobs that exist to bridge that gap already?
For sure, there's a lot of work there. The relationship between city planning and conservation really is fluid depending on where you're at. Because a lot of places or cities or communities, it's such a big process, right, planning a city. Oftentimes, different communities will pick different things to focus on, and conservation doesn't always rise to the top. Easy examples, a lot of cities focus on economic development because they're focused on growing their tax base. That oftentimes are focused on, let's say, transportation, right? Other common elements. So it's almost like conservation just usually isn't high enough that there's other quote unquote, I would say, bigger fish to fry that it gets, but that's not to say that, you know, the EPA and others spend a absolute insane amount of time and energy on conservation. I think everyone in the room probably knows this. So I think there is a link. I would just say it's very inconsistent, and that's probably reflective somewhat of our own inconsistencies ourselves and what we prioritize and value in cities. I'm waiting for someone to help.
All right, we have time for one last question.
All right, let's see if I can do it.
Oh, pretty good.
Yeah, I think one thing I was really struck by, and I think I was struck by it because something that I've struggled with a lot are the trade-offs. And I think Andrew, when you were talking, for example, about air conditioners, and you talked about the fact that in reality what we're doing is pumping the hot air back outside. But I think those sorts of issues come up more generally, especially when we're trying on a personal level to modify things at our house or, do those sorts of things. For example, we've been thinking of going from a gas stove to either electric or induction, but of course, both of those use electricity, which again, is dependent on fossil fuels. I've seen places where they take enormous amounts of land and they just cover it with solar panels. And yeah, the solar panels are generating all the electricity that this particular, place needs, but they're also essentially destroying the environment and making that environment a non-suitable habitat for birds and other organisms. Or even the issue that came up a few minutes ago about trees and people in certain places saying, well, yeah, you have more trees, but it also means when you have these huge storms that we get now, you have more trees to fall over and damage your house or your car or, you lose electricity. And so I was just wondering if any of you have any thoughts about how one negotiates those trade-offs, and, I just curious about what you think about that.
Maybe one, I don't know if there's a perfect answer. One anecdote is when we're doing climate action plans, this comes up all the time. And I think it is really difficult in a lot of different ways. I'll start with the gas one, actually. I am obsessed with cooking. And if I'm not cooking with fire with like a wok, I'm sort of doing a disservice to, I would say, my heritage in terms of kind of historical cooking methods. But I have kind of come to accept that the climate crisis is so bad that it is pretty much all options above at this point to get to where we need to be. So I myself have kind of accepted induction's actually easier to clean. Maybe I just need to live with that. I can clean less finally. And that ties into your other question about like solar, right? Like it takes lots of fields. We've talked to a lot of folks about this, and a lot of where we've ended up is that it's not like solar or other things by itself are going to get us there. At this point, I was kind of somewhat poking fun, but not really at the new technologies for carbon sequestration through the air. And one of my great colleagues, she's always reminded me to say that it is a crisis, and at this point, we need even that to get the 1%. So in some ways, you say, it's not great for, let's say, the immediate ecological environment to have the panels everywhere. The other alternative is letting the climate crisis spiral even worse. And if you're looking at the long arc of history here, the choice is a lot more straightforward, I guess.
I don't have any profound response or insight, except to say that you're absolutely right. I mean, and the more drastic the climate change, the more challenging the trade-offs, the tougher the trade-offs, and that I think it's kind of a good framework to understand climate change as narrowing or constricting the options that are available to us to lead healthy, desirable lives. And it's going to mean more things have to get sacrificed along that path. And to recognize that, but, I don't know that there's a formula that you can apply. It just takes an acknowledgement of what are those choices that you have and having a context within which to weigh them.
All right, that gets us at our time for the evening. Let's thank again our three very awesome speakers. And thank you all for coming out tonight.